I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to the fourth chapter of Bradbury and Karney's Intimate Relationships book. So today we'll be discussing gender. And so we'll talk about the difference between sex and gender, the historical context, and then some evolutionary and social structural views of what gender is. But let's get started by talking about baby Storm. And that's baby Storm sitting on their mom's lap with the hot pink hair. And so the mom is Kathy, and she was expecting a third child while she was homeschooling Jazz and Keo. And David was a teacher. He also has the hot pink hair. He was a teacher at an alternative middle school. And they decided not to reveal the gender assigned at birth to their third child, Storm. And so Storm was labeled as a they be. We characterize relationships by the gender of the partners, noting which pairs are same sex and which are different sex. But humans vary in so many ways, such as hair color, like hot pink, food preference, athletic ability, but few areas seem to carry as much weight for some people as gender. So newborns generally can't recognize the difference between female and male faces. They do recognize their mother's voice, though. I think it's important to point that out. But infants as young as 3 months begin to show a preference for female faces. Adults prefer faces that are easier to categorize, and they rate them as more attractive on average than faces that are less distinct. Let's talk about a few definitional terms here. So sex is the biological features that characterize the male and female of a species, and it's usually assigned at birth. Primary sex characteristics are ones that you're born with, so like chromosomes and genitals, and they support sexual reproduction. And then secondary sex characteristics emerge during puberty, and they signal fertility and maturity, so breast development in women, facial hair in men, and various other things, which I am not going to get into. Some people have a binary assumption, which is this idea that sexes can be divided into two fixed, unchanging, and non-overlapping categories. That is the binary assumption. Most people's chromosomes match patterns associated with either male, which is XY, or female, double X. But there are people who are born intersex, and they possess chromosomes or physical characteristics that are not clearly identifiable as male or female. Some people put it as frequently as 1 in 60. Some people say, depending on how you define it, it's more like 1 in 10,000 births. Gender is the attitudes, traits, and behaviors a culture identifies as masculine and feminine. And so this gives rise to the idea of tertiary sex characteristics, which are expectations about what's acceptable social roles for women and men. Gender identity is the perception people have of themselves as masculine or feminine. And so for most people, the vast majority of people, their gender identity matches their sex. But there are people who are transgender, and that's a transgender flag to the right. And there's a difference between, they make the difference between sex and gender more explicit. Some choose to alter their bodies, changing the sex they were assigned at birth to the sex that conforms with how they understand themselves. Gender expression is how fulfilled expectations about gender, or how these expectations are fulfilled through behaviors and interactions with others. So men and women used to be defined as opposites. And so you used to hear about the opposite sex, or the weaker sex, or the fairer sex. Table 4.1 lists a number of traits which some people who were surveyed said were desirable in men, and such as things like having power. So a man who acts as a leader is viewed positively. And that there were also traits that were desirable in women, and those were associated with serving others. And so it's good if a woman is affectionate. And then there were gender neutral traits too, like being likable. Everybody likes someone who's likable and kind. Some people identify as androgynous, which means that they express both masculine and feminine traits. It seems like most people express both masculine and feminine traits, and that's the flag for androgyny, which is in a gray field. All kinds of positive things. They're less constrained by expectations. They have higher levels of self-esteem. They express their emotions more readily, and they're more desired as partners, according to this research. That is the flag of Tinder, because we're going to talk about Tinder here in a second. So the idea is that there's schemas, and these are cognitive representations that organize ideas and beliefs about certain concepts. So we would have a schema about what a man acts like and what a woman acts like. To capture the fuller range of gender identities and expressions, Tinder allows users to choose from 37 options, and Facebook has even more. So a question some people might ask is, if categories are this loose, why talk about gender at all? And the reason that the authors come up with is because the idea of two genders has shaped the way people have thought about intimate relationships. And it certainly is indicative of the rest of this book. So now we get into gender stereotypes. These in many ways are just reflective of media stereotypes, I believe. So Facebook says that the topic of female participants is usually things like friends, family, and social life, where males talk about swearing, anger, discussion of objects instead of people, and the use of argumentative language. Who doesn't? Who gets convinced of someone else's argument on Facebook? And I don't see much swearing. Some believe that what it means to be a man or a woman fluctuates depending on where we are historically, geographically, culturally, and socially. And so this is always trotted out as an example that babies dressed in pink are assumed to be girls and are treated more delicately. And Marlboro cigarettes used to be a woman's brand in the quote-unquote woman's brand in the 1920s, like Virginia Slims. And now that's like super macho cowboy kind of things. In cultures where men dominated public life, which is every culture, some male philosophers proposed that men were uniquely capable of relationships that public life required. So this really goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans in the Western tradition. And women were considered too selfish or emotional for like public service. A meta-analysis is when researchers combine all known research relating one variable, such as gender identity, to another variable, which is empathy or aggression. Meta-analyses are essentially studies of studies, where you just take a whole bunch of research and you kind of jam it into one big study. Some people dismiss meta-analysis as garbage in, garbage out. Other people consider it to be waste management. From this comes the D statistic, and this is a number that captures the degree of similarity between men and women. So when D is equal to 0, it means men and women don't differ on that characteristic. The further D deviates from 0, the more confident, quote in quotes, we are that these differences are real. So what did they find in terms of differences between men and women? Men are more physically and verbally aggressive than women. Women are more skilled at expressing emotions than men. Women are more likely to care about a partner's social class, and men are more likely to care about their attractiveness. Now, other research that I've seen shows that that's a heterosexual female characteristic, that lesbians don't care about jobs and social class as much as heterosexual women do. And that women are more likely than men to seek out emotional support as a means of coping and to ruminate on the difficulties they're facing. This is thought to be to account for the greater incidence of depression in women. They're more likely to ruminate, that's when you think about like things that have happened and you relive conversations over and over again, thinking how they could have gone differently, living in the past rather than moving forward in the future. And results have found reliable gender differences given the limitations of these studies, which are enormous. So there's an evolutionary view of gender differences. And the idea is that females bear the greater burden in reproduction, and this seems to be true in all mammalian species, that women are more likely to prefer status and resources, and men are attuned to cues of fertility and attractiveness. Men report that they would like to have more sexual partners than women. And more men than women were actively looking for a short-term mate regardless of their current relationship status. Now, one of the ideas is this idea of intrasexual competition. And this is the ways women and men compete to gain advantage in the mating marketplace. So, how you dress, how you act, how you do your hair, all those kinds of things. And males seek status in order to attract females because females are attracted to status. And so one of the things we talk about, there's a book by Etkoff. She's at Harvard. She wrote a book called Survival of the Prettiest that talks about how men, one of the reasons why men seek attractive partners, and this is true for heterosexual men and gay men, is because their social status is judged by the attractiveness of the partner that they're with. So if you see some guy with some, supermodel or something, you're going to think, well, they must have a lot of money or a lot of status. And so your partner is indicative of status, and that's a big part of the evolutionary view. The social structural view believes that essentially people aren't, that society determines what we believe, and that power is what's really important. And power is an individual's capacity to alter the behavior of others, so to have power over other people, while also resisting their influence. And so this comes out in social structural theory, which says that differences in how money, power, and resources are divided between men and women are important. So there are expectations of gender-based stereotypes which are conferred on boys and girls, and they're socialized into these roles. And societies punish those who violate these role expectations. Virtually all patriarchal societies, which is all societies, at least that we know of in human history, reward men for developing independence and assertiveness, and women for developing emotional sensitivity and a willingness to sacrifice. So there's two different theories, evolutionary and social structural, essentially for the same outcomes. And so they're providing different narratives to explain the same data. Gender differences emerge from social structures. So as female empowerment and gender equality increase across cultures, women show less of a preference for older partners and men show less of a preference for younger ones. I've talked about this in other classes too, though. One of the things that they find, or that is found, is that as it's really an issue of money more than it is about equality across a culture. That so Demi Moore is a classic example of this. As women are empowered with more money, they seek younger and more attractive mates, and that seems to be a determining factor too. This is all very complicated stuff, or at least it's a big briar patch to have to walk through. Changes in the power structure in a situation or society, or so if you change them, theoretically the behaviors of men and women change too. And that's Coco Chanel off to the right, who was certainly a woman who had status and power. However, gender is a very weak indicator of how an individual will behave, especially when compared to power and social status. So it's an interesting disclaimer. Relationship disagreements, this is gender and intimacy, produce a stronger physiological response in women than men. And men respond more strongly than women when their competence or dominance is threatened. The sense of belonging is also different. Women, and again, this is talking about men and women as if they were binary, which they're not. Women can connect with a few close others, so close friends, while men get together with larger groups. And there's a large group of guys hanging out together in the picture there. On average, women seem to be more aware of their relationships than men. And divorcing men are 8 to 10 times more likely than their wives to say they don't know why their relationship ended. And I think that's true. Women talk about their relationships recall more details, they demonstrate greater accuracy and vividness, and they express more emotional range. They're more likely to take the perspective of the couple rather than themselves, that we are more important than you or I. Women are more prone to express emotion and more skilled at decoding nonverbal behavior. And they're taught that responding to a partner's emotions is their job, which would be a... Yeah. Let's talk about Masters and Johnson. They were sex researchers in the 1960s, and they reported that the sexual response cycles of men and women were nearly identical, that men experience enormous cultural pressure to express interest in sex and pursue opportunities to have sex and to be instantly aroused and ready for action whenever the time comes. Women, though, are sent powerful but contradictory messages about how they should approach sex. And so they should be present themselves as sexually enticing, but also chaste and pure. One review of research found that men report higher motivation for sex than women in every study, regardless of the form of measurement. And I've talked about this study in class too, because it really shows, this is a study done with heterosexual men and heterosexual women, or at least it's a heteronormative study by Clark and Hatfield in 1989. It's the Attractive Stranger Study. So they had research assistants just randomly who were attractive walk up to different sexed undergraduates on campus and say, you know, I've noticed you on campus and I find you to be very attractive. And then there were one of 3 possible invitations. Would you like to go on a date with me tonight? They found that men and women were equally likely to agree to go on a date, because it is nice if an attractive stranger comes up to you and asks you out. So it's about 50% of men and 50% of women. I've been noticing you're on campus. I find you to be very attractive. Would you like to come back to my apartment with me? With no indication of what's going to happen at the apartment. Women were much less likely to be willing to go to the apartment. Men were more likely to go to the apartment than to go on a date. And then the crucial third condition, I've noticed you on campus. I find you to be very attractive. Would you like to come back to my apartment and go to bed? No women agreed to. And I can't remember the exact number, 90-some% of men agreed to. And one of the things that Clark and Hatfield noted was that men who said no oftentimes asked for a rain check or came up with some excuse for why they couldn't do it now, but they could do it later. So yeah, that tells you a lot about genders, or at least that's one study. Regardless of their gender, raters agreed that women who accept an invitation to have casual sex, and you can watch videos where attractive strangers come up to people and ask them for sex, but women who accepts an invitation with a stranger is less intelligent, less mentally healthy, more promiscuous, less competent, and more risky. I'm assuming that's compared to men rather than compared to someone who rejects an invitation for casual sex. Let's talk about ending relationships. Women tend to recognize problems in their relationships earlier and accept the need for counseling earlier. In different sex marriages, because this is where we have the most data, data collected from wives predicts whether a marriage will end in divorce significantly better than data collected from husbands. As we said, men generally don't even know why they're getting divorced. And they call divorce the big D. The Country Western School of Psychology has argued, I'm going through the big D, I don't mean Dallas. And there's another song where they talk about, she got the gold mine and I got the shaft. Wives are more likely than husbands to want a divorce, to be the first to talk about getting one, and to actually file for divorce. And divorce is initiated 2/3 of the time by women and only 1/3 of the time by men in different sex marriages. Well, that's chapter 4, and I hope you have a great day.